oppression. England was determined to put down the American rebellion, and even before Congress made a decision, the British fleet had arrived at America's shores.
As the Second Continental Congress sat down to debate independence in Philadelphia, the British were arriving off Manhattan, and it must have been a fantastic scene. First 50 ships, then another 50, all coming toward Manhattan with their sails aloft. They were about to mount the most powerful campaign, both by sea and by land, to put down this pesky rebellion.
It was on that day, July 2nd, 1776, when the 13 American colonies all voted yes, that we became free and independent. On that day, a new nation called the United States of America was born. In order to understand this document better, let's break it down into its various parts in its unedited form, as Jefferson wrote it. First, the preamble, the opening sentence that states the purpose of the document.
The first paragraph of the Declaration is in some ways the most novel. We remember the second paragraph, but the first paragraph begins when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected with them with another. Compare that to most similar documents, the English Declaration of Rights, for example, or the preamble to the Virginia Constitution, which the state of Virginia had adopted only a few weeks earlier. They begin, whereas. The drama is much greater. And I think of what those words must have meant, for example, to American soldiers to whom the Declaration was read on Manhattan. They may have felt that they were just another underfinanced, undermanned army about to be destroyed by the greatest military power in the world. And this declaration arrives that says, basically, this is an event of significance in human history. And it is an event, as the last line went on to say, that mankind will be interested. A decent respect for the opinions of mankind demands that we declare the causes of this separation. It put the whole event on a much more heroic level.
The second sentence has become the most famous and most quoted of the document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,
that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
With those words, the founders of the country, even prior to the Constitution, placed the country's very existence on a unique footing. What they taught is that our basic rights as human beings, rights that have to be respected in the political order, are not the gifts of princes. They're not something bestowed on us by government. They're not the fruit of a social contract, an agreement that we'll leave each other alone or anything like that. Rather, these most fundamental human rights are gifts from God. They're natural rights that we have not by virtue of citizenship as such, but by virtue of being human beings.
The writers of the Declaration of Independence realized the document had multiple purposes. One, it meant to garner a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. The Declaration was a means of submitting its facts to a candid world. This meant influencing public opinion both at home and abroad.
I think that the phrase in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which suggests it is written for mankind, from a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, is somewhat misleading. We think, therefore, it must be a world proclamation, and obviously to some extent it was, but I think the Declaration was written primarily for a domestic audience.
The document is largely made up of charges against King George III, accusing him of a long train of abuses and a history of repeated injuries and usurpations over an extended period of time. Independence could be justified only if the charges against the king were convincing and of sufficient gravity to warrant dissolution of his authority over the American people. There are 29 charges against King George III, listed point after point, and arranged in ever-increasing seriousness, from indignities to downright tyranny.
By 1776, it was clear you could only end the reign of a living king for one of two reasons. The first I find particularly charming, that the king was a rex inutilis, a useless king, or in other words, inept. If he's inept, you could get rid of him. And the other reason was that the king was evil. And evil had a particular implication, that is, that he had interfered with the rights and freedoms of the people. What the Americans said in 1776 is, we have the evil kind, and that's why we're getting rid of him. That was important. It's important, and I think it helps to explain why the Americans and some other countries which have grown out of the British tradition have constitutional crises rather than coup d'etat. It is an important precedent for political stability.
Here are some of the charges. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary to the public good. He has forbidden his government to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance.
Well, what I suppose is peculiar about the Declaration of Independence compared to rather similar documents that were issued by states and towns and counties is that it has such a long list of grievances. And they open with some that were very difficult to identify, particularly for people abroad, because they're stated in very general terms, and often they referred to events that were played out on the local level and were not common to all of the colonies.
He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people.
The opening paragraph, of course, begins not whereas, but when in the course of human events. And then instead of saying bye, bye, bye when he got to the grievances, he made it more emphatic. He has, he has, he has.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures.
This probably referred to the royal governor's convening of the Massachusetts legislature in Cambridge. And loyalists like Thomas Jefferson were very quick to point out that Cambridge wasn't really all that far from Boston. It was not uncomfortable. It generally convened at Harvard College, and the legislatures could stay in the homes of professors, which were not uncomfortable. So it seemed a rather cooked-up provision.
The next group of charges, however, could not be described as trivial or insignificant. He has combined with others, meaning the British Parliament, to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitutions and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us of the benefits of trial by jury, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever.
I think few people today would say that George III was a tyrant. We understand his motivation rather differently. I think the reason the Declaration attacks the king should be understood within a British constitutional context. The rule in Britain was the king can do no harm. The king was symbolic of the state and the ultimate authority of the state. In ordinary politics, people forbore attacking the king. They always said his minister was responsible for any policy, even if they thought the king was personally responsible for that policy. The only time that you could publicly attack the king was when you thought the depredations had gone so far, the grievances had gone so far, that the state had yielded its legitimacy. In other words, to attack the king was to announce revolution.
In the third and concluding group of charges against the king, Jefferson cites the most recent and most serious offenses against the American people. He has abdicated government here, withdrawing his governors and declaring us out of his allegiance and protection. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny. He has incited treasonable insurrections of our fellow citizens with the allurements of forfeiture and confiscation of property. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain.
People are always struck by Jefferson's long, final grievance against the king, and often it's misunderstood. It is taken to be an attack on the slave system, which it was not. It blamed the king for the slave trade, and it was written in such a way that it sounded as if the king had somehow personally piloted the ships to Africa, slashed the whip to get the slaves on board, piloted it west, sold the slaves, as if the king personally had carried on the slave trade, which of course was patently untrue. And I think that's one reason why the Congress eliminated the provision. But why was Jefferson so angry about this? What really prompted his anger was the fact that the king had vetoed efforts on the part of the Virginia legislature to tax the importation of slaves.
Following the charges against the king, Jefferson inserted a long paragraph of complaints about the British people. Among other things, there were these: "We have been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. The road to happiness and to glory is open to us too. We will climb it apart from them and acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our eternal separation. We must forget our former love for them, and to hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends."
The end of the Declaration in Jefferson's draft goes on and on with an attack on the British people. This is often forgotten today, but it was very important at the time, I think, because the American colonists hoped very much for the support of the British government against the depredations of their government. They saw evidence that the grievances the Americans were suffering were also suffered by the British. Some Americans hoped for a hands-across-the-sea revolution with uprisings in Britain and America, and possibly even in Ireland. When it didn't work and they were left to themselves, there was certainly a reservoir of anger, which comes out in Jefferson's draft.
Then, on the basis of the charges, Jefferson wrote the concluding part of the Declaration of Independence in a very powerful and beautiful way. "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America," this, by the way, was the first time the nation's name was used officially in any document, "do reject and renounce all allegiance and subjection to the kings of Great Britain and all others who may thereafter claim by, through, or under them." Which meant a rejection not only of King George III, but all future kings. A rejection of monarchy, as well as of those public servants the king appoints. And further, we utterly dissolve all political connection which may heretofore have subsisted between us and the people or Parliament of Great Britain. And finally, we do assert and declare these colonies to be free and independent states. And the wonderful closing sentence: And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other